All right, cool. So I have Eric Ries here. Actually, I'm terrible at names. Am I even pronouncing that right?
You are. Yeah, Reese like the candy. That's exactly right.
I interviewed you many years ago for Traction, the book, when I was first getting started. And since then, you've become much more famous. And Lean Startup has become much more famous. And so, thank you for taking the time to talk to me again.
My pleasure.
I would love to dig into things that you don't normally talk about. If anyone is following you, they would realize that you've done a lot of interviews in the past couple of weeks, which I have watched,
Yeah.
read most of them. And
I'm sorry.
um, I would love to talk about things you don't normally talk about. So,
Yeah, that's great.
if you don't mind, I'll just jump right into random
Let's do
topics.
it.
Okay, so first off, since most people listening to this are going to be interested in traction as a concept, I want,
Yeah.
I want to dig into traction and just kind of talk about that. So, um, I asked you to read a couple chapters of our book, so thank you for doing that. And in that book, we probably characterized lean startup in a way that you would not characterize it. And so I wanted to kind of tear apart our characterization and get to uh, some real assessment of how to think about traction in the scope of lean startup. So
Totally.
in our book, we essentially have a structured framework, a little more structured than the general lean startup build, measure, learn structure, but still essentially applying build, measure, learn to just
Hmm.
traction with more defined steps in the sense that we identify 19 kind of customer acquisition channels you can use to grow and help you identify what experiments to run to kind of make that build,
Yeah. Yeah.
learn loop.
That's what makes it so useful.
Exactly. So in writing about it, where I think we may have gotten wrong is we said, okay, uh, lean startup is mainly for product development, and we're mainly for traction development. And you need to apply a good framework for both to succeed
Yeah.
to decrease technical risk and market risk. And so I know that you reading a lot of your interviews in the book is like you think of, well, there's the growth hypothesis applies into lean startup. And so I
Yeah.
want to kind of talk about how you think about traction and how it kind of
Sure. Sure.
fits.
Well,
Go
I
for
don't
it.
have any. I have no complaints about what you wrote in the book for two reasons. One is it's like a very classic business book thing to do, to be like our operating system for our theory is compatible with these other well-known theories, but you don't have
Yeah,
to adopt any specific other well-known theory because I'm in the middle of trying to convince you to adopt my damn theory, and so again,
exactly.
convincing people to adopt two theories at once is just too fucking hard. Yeah, so no complaints there. Plus, the misconception that lean startup is all about product development per se is like it's like a very prevalent idea out there, and it's not like it's wrong. I mean, my background's in product development, so there's like people ask me for examples of lean startup, I tend to think of product examples first and foremost because it's just what pops into my head. That's the way that I think. But I tried in the book, to be really clear that the question of what do customers find valuable and how do you find more of them are co-equal risk factors in the development of most initiatives, whether products or non-products for that matter. And that one without the other is totally useless, right? Growth without value is a cancer, and value without growth is, art for art's sake. And hey, occasionally I meet someone who like is a truly art, avant-garde bohemian artist who just wants to do their watercolors in their, studio somewhere and doesn't actually care if anyone ever sees it or they impact the world ever, but most people, even people who have an artistic persuasion, care about impact. And if you're not focused on both, how do you grow that impact to hit the scale that you aspire to, and of course making sure that the impact is positive, you can get in real trouble. And the reason it's important to think of these as kind of co-equal aspects of lean startup is not because I care that people use lean startup as the overarching umbrella, under which they slot other theories, versus you can have an overarching theory that you slot lean startup under. That doesn't matter. What matters is once you think of it that way, the method that you use to solve those two problems is actually the same. And this is why, even though, you wrote that in the book, it doesn't bother me. You're advocating for people to use a rapid experimentation, build, measure, learn style system to answer their traction questions, just like they would, their kind of more product questions. And as long as you adopt that methodology, you can call it whatever you want. I'm happy as a clam.
So in the co-equal sense, like we kind of took that even further and basically opted for what we had called the 50% rule, where
Yeah.
you should really focus 50% of your time because because what you said, like both of us are probably very product focused, and if you don't
Yeah.
allocate it,
You got to have a rule like that for
yeah.
sure.
So you don't disagree with that kind of assessment?
No, not every
Not
person,
everything's gonna be 50-50.
yeah, exactly. But
Yeah,
like,
it's a guideline.
because the people that we tend to spend our time with are 100-0,
Yeah,
pushing for 50-50 might get them to like 90-10 or 80-20. And that's a
right.
huge improvement. And it's funny, in the early days of lean startup, um, companies were both very product focused and very marketing focused. But what that meant in the old school ways was that the product team is spending 18 months or 24 months, on a waterfall development process. There's no customer information whatsoever. There's no experimentation. And because you have this huge amount of time to wait for the launch, your marketing team is out there doing focus groups and kind of like market research, quote unquote, like basically just like thinking to themselves about, hey, what could the Super Bowl ad look like? And what is the big launch program? And they're not really talking to customers. They're not running any experiments. Like everything's like in a vacuum. And in those days, we used to try to advocate for 50-50 between like time you spent at your whiteboard, like making up grand theories, and 50% of time that you spent actually doing stuff with customers. And of course, all we wanted, that we were like 50-50, but really what we really want people is to spend like 10%. I used to be like, could you spend one day a week or half a day a week out of the building talking to customers, and so it's a time-honored tradition to kind of push for, to try to get something onto people's radar by trying to make it as important as the thing that they care about in the hopes that they'll eventually care about it at all. The truth is that most of the kind of the modern startup way now is to actually have a growth team, like somebody, like an actual team structure incorporated into your corporate structure, so that there's somebody and some group of people like thinking about growth all the time.
So would you?
And I think that's really powerful.
So yeah, so like that's kind of what we were trying to do is empower. When I initially went out and talked to people, I was like, okay, I buy the build, measure, learn thing, as do most people. And what you said a lot in the interviews is that when people ask you like, well, how do you validate this? And you're like, well, it's kind of, ex ante proven, because it's like you're just removing waste. So like, how could it not be valid? Or essentially saying you're applying the scientific method to something.
Yeah.
And you didn't have the scientific method, so it has to be better, which I totally buy. And that's kind of how I view, like the next step of that was, okay, I'm attempting to build, measure, learn, but I saw a lot of people messing it up because they just weren't measuring correctly.
Yeah.
Didn't know how to set up the experiments, especially for traction. And that's kind of where this framework came out, is giving people a little more guidance the traction side.
And those kind of resources are super important. I mean, I'm not the way that I write is not that way. I'm not a step-by-step, do this kind of person. So like I tend to write in a more abstract way to say, look, we got to understand the root cause and the principles behind it. The liability, the plus, in defense of my approach, the plus of it is if you understand the principles that underlie it, you can apply in a wide range of situations this idea. But the real flip side is you can apply it wrong and think you're doing it right pretty easily, because it's pretty abstract, and people only have the case studies that I've published in my book, which is not that many, to guide them. I think what's really helpful when people are struggling with, well, how do I apply these principles to this domain? It's really nice to have a kind of like guide who's right there next to you to say, hey, here's how it could look like, and here's a little bit more prescriptive thing to try and something to react against. I think that opens up the ideas to a lot of people. So I'm very pro the traction book and pro that approach. And in addition, when I'm I have, so you want to talk about something I don't normally talk about. So here's something I almost never talk about because it makes people, a little bit uncomfortable. But what I am seeking is a grand unified theory of what I call entrepreneurial management, which is how do you manage a team of people in an entrepreneurial situation, which is a situation of extreme uncertainty. And right now, most companies deal with many, many, many different kinds of these situations, and they have completely different on paper approaches to each. So like, for example, you have your product development team. Most companies, product development team, maybe they're doing lean startup, or, maybe you have a design team doing design thinking. But then you also have you have a marketing team that's like doing marketing campaigns. It's not doing lean startup at all. It has their own totally marketing oriented, crazy system. But you also generally have corp dev once you get to a certain size. So you're doing partnerships and negotiations that are all extremely uncertain. Big companies, their corp dev is buying startups and trying to figure out, how do I value the startups that I buy? You have a finance function that's trying to evaluate the ROI of internal initiatives, including some startup initiatives. Their approach is also totally different than anything I've just described. And then you have, when you get to a certain size in your company, you start to do process change initiatives. Like you realize, we need to have a new HR policy, or we need to change the way that people are hired and fired, or we need to adopt a new IT system to manage. Like every single one of the things I just described is highly uncertain because you've never done it before. And by definition, you're changing the core systems of your company. And when you do that, it's very unpredictable what's going to happen next. Now, every single one of those situations I just described is actually a startup situation. And so it's really helpful as a company to have a common operating system to say, look, when you're in a startup situation, it's important to start small, think big, scale fast. And
so how far along are you on this grand unified management theory? Do you have structure like that you are kind of headed towards?
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, this is what I want the new book.
I've also heard you talk about another problem, which is even if the teams are doing their version of build, measure, learn, you still have this handoff problem.
Yeah, exactly right.
Non-coordinated problem.
Yeah, so like, what's funny, I'll tell you a funny story. I was working with a very big company, one of their innovation teams, working on a new product. And one of the things I always say as a matter of routine, I mentioned it very briefly in the Lean Startup. It's like, I think there's maybe one paragraph dedicated to, you should have a cross-functional team. Every function that is involved in the development of the thing should be represented on a full-time basis on your team. And I just thought in the book, I was like, I'm done. I made the recommendation, finished. One sentence, it's like, that's all you need to know. It's so obvious.
You're like the Fed, people are supposed to be reading.
Yeah, I'm like, why did anybody read footnote B on page 397? I was shocked that people read the book and they didn't remember this critically important thing that I only mentioned one time in one sentence. And so, so I work with teams and I always mention that, and then they don't do it. And then they're like, well, why? I don't really need that. And so this is a team that was making a regulated, in a regulated industry. So they needed someone from legal on their team and they didn't want to do it. And I had to went through a whole rigmarole trying to convince them, and they wouldn't do it. And the reason they didn't want to do it is well, the people from legal hate our guts. And they're always saying no, and they're bad, all the complaints people make about these gatekeeper functions. And we eventually, through arm twisting, got one of their legal people assigned to the team. Of course, they assigned the person who hates this team the most, the person they hate the most, like the guy who is just the most fire-breathing dragon, evil person. They bring him into a Lean Startup workshop that I'm leading, and he comes in super pissed. But over the course of the workshop, as he starts to understand the principle, he's like, wait a minute. This means that every MVP, every experiment we do will have compliance built into it from the start. That's actually really exciting. So anyway, he comes around, becomes really powerful. They had it's a great kumbaya experience. Everyone, the skies part. He joins the team. They make great progress. And a month later, I'm talking to them about some other thing. And they're like, oh, we have this problem where we have this IT thing that we need to get changed. And I'm like, well, do you have someone from IT on your team? And they're like, oh, no, of course not. I'm like, we just did this whole kumbaya. How can you not generalize from the idea that if you needed legal on your team, because you have a legal problem, you also, and I'm like, what other functions do you not have on your team? And they're like, we got a whole bunch. So, the important thing is to get people to understand the general principle that when you're in this situation, there are certain critical things you should do every time, like a checklist. You should have, the way that your projects are funded it has to be a certain way. Team composition is a certain way. The way people get promoted is a certain way. The accountability paradigm is certain. That's just certain things that you have to get right, or you're not going to get that startup team energy to go solve your startup level problem. What I just so I'm working on it. I don't have the crisp build, measure, learn. Here's the bumper sticker.
Fair enough.
That's what I'm working on right now.
The cross-functional team piece, just to put that in, is you need buy-in from things initially, psychologically, if anyone's really going to be committed to it. Is that kind of where you're going with that? It reminds me of startup founders who are always looking for the non-tech or tech founder who it's better if you find someone, you get buy-in with the idea together, and
right. Well, exactly. That's exactly it. And what happens is so I'll go back to this regulatory example. If you don't have the expertise on your team to understand the real full stack problem you're trying to solve, you wind up using heuristics and shorthand without really understanding what's going on. It's if you want an engineering metaphor, it's when you only understand JavaScript, but you don't understand the rest of how the rest of the internet works. You can still solve a lot of problems, but you're going to periodically run into a problem that like you just don't understand what's possible. You have like a misconception about how the whole stack works, and that can lead your startup astray. In a normal job, it's not that big a deal, but in a startup, that tends to be a major problem. So here's an example. This was a medical device. And so one of the rules that the FDA has is that you can't pre-sell a medical device before it has FDA approval. So you can't go to a hospital and say, hey, I'm going to do a Kickstarter campaign for a medical device. Like that'll come out in 18 months. Can I have your money now? That's against the law. So a lot of people conclude from that you can't do an MVP with a medical device because you have to have built the device, sold it, to go the regulatory process. Everything takes long. It's really expensive. So when we had the lawyer in the room, the team was describing an MVP they wanted to do. And they were like, oh, you know what? Shoot, this MVP is not going to work because you can't pre-sell, the FDA rule. And they're like, oh yeah, fuck it. And the lawyer was sitting there and he's like, excuse me, have any of you actually read the FDA statute that governs this area? And everyone looks at him and they're like, no. It's like, well, do you really think that there's a one-sentence rule promulgated by the federal government that says you can't pre-sell a medical device? Does that sound like how the federal government promulgates rules to you? They're like, well, no, I guess not. He's like, no, of course not. The actual regulation is 2,000 pages long. Like, I've actually read it. It doesn't say you can't. It says, and he starts to blah, 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 blah jargon. And he's like, I don't understand. They're like, so what's your point? He's like, well, actually, the MVP you just described is legal because there's an exemption. Subparagraph C, clause 17, like says that you can do the thing that you just described. So we're fine. And they were like, really? How did you know that? It's like, because it's my fucking job to read the actuals to know what's going on. And I see that so often in these cross-functional teams. Taking it back to a growth team, to the traction question. Some people hear value hypothesis, growth hypothesis, or whatever their 50-50 rule, and they're like, oh God, engineering over here, marketing over here, no problem. But this is not an organizational structure that's going to work, because if you have people who are functionally siloed, you're going to have this problem where you say, okay, I got my traction team, we want to go do an experiment. And someone's going to be like, oh, but that requires a minor change to the product. Forget it. Can't be done. We'd have to go lobby the engineering team for a month, and they never want to do anything. Whereas, the number of times you have an engineer on the team who's actually focused on the problem, they can be like, oh, that's no big deal. Let me do that while you wait. Done. And like, how? Oh my God, how did you do that? It's like, well, I actually know what I'm talking about. It's my job. It's like, I can tell you that things are possible that you may not realize. And I see that a lot. You see on the other side too, right? You have an engineering team with no marketing people there. They're like, oh, customers require like this crazy, thing that they've made up that they think is essential. And you have a person who actually understands the customer well to say, hey, actually, that's not what customers require. There's an easier thing that we could do that would be just as good from the customer's point of view. So like that cross-functional collaboration is clearly part of the kind of startup operating system.
Have you gotten far down that too? Because one of the things we do here is the concept of directly responsible individual. Mm-hmm. Like even at the cross-functional team, someone at the end of the day is responsible and accountable for each project and each task.
Yeah, that's super important.
You have thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, see, one of the cool things about calling this, so like my kind of current kick is to be like, look, let's call this organizational structure a team with a directly responsible individual, the certain funding, certain structure, let's just call it a startup. That's actually what it is. Yeah. So a startup is a management tool in your toolbox, just like you have all kinds of other tools in your toolbox, and you know how to do marketing, and you know how to hire people, and you know how to have.
I saw in one of your comments on, I think, Hacker News yesterday. Yeah. Someone asked you is this a startup in my big company? And you're like, does it have these 6 things?
Yeah, exactly right.
Is that kind of where you're headed with that?
Yeah, exactly. If it doesn't have those 6 things, it's not a startup, so let's not call it that. But if you have those things in place, then it's a startup. So then is there such a thing as a startup with no founder, no entrepreneur, no CEO? Of course not. That's ridiculous. If you have a committee of 6 people who are all part-time co-responsible for something, does that sound like a startup to you? If someone just gets assigned to a startup, you wake up one morning, it's like, please report to Sand Hill Road, number 2950, you are assigned to startup. That doesn't sound like so you can start to develop this intuition to be like, that doesn't seem right to me. No, I don't think that's right. And what's crazy to me, this is the thing that people don't believe, but I've now seen it firsthand, even in some of the most bureaucratic organizations in the world. When you set the conditions right, you can make people who look like, on the surface, really boring bureaucratic jerks. You can transform them into entrepreneurs, in fairly short order if you change the systems that are around them. And by calling it a startup and making it a common practice across the company, you can start to just develop some best practices and develop a career path and say, this person is really good as an entrepreneur. Maybe they'd be good to lead this other project, even though it's not in their area of expertise technically, because how important is it that sometimes having an outside perspective can be really valuable in a startup, and we can start to leverage that kind of thinking into the DNA of the company.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's essentially how we're organized here. At some point, we were doing it without the DRI
Yeah,
process.
that's very problematic.
That did not work, and so we immediately kind of figured that piece out.
Yeah, that's
How
awesome.
how do you? So you mentioned. Do you have any theory there of some of these other orgs, parts of the org that aren't traditionally, like you mentioned, finance, you mentioned legal.
Yeah,
Some of those are, especially in an early startup, contracted out. You know,
yeah,
you think they just become more important as a company gets bigger, and you kind of ignore them at first.
pretty
Uh,
much.
yeah. Okay.
Well, it's actually that it's not that you ignore them; it's that their important functions are done by the founder personally.
Yeah.
So like people hate finance. Finance is the most
Right. I
reviled.
did it. I did it for many years myself
Yeah.
until we kind of
And,
hired.
and people think that when people think about finance, they think, well, finance is preparing the balance, the balance sheets and the account statements, and it's making sure that the money doesn't, like kind of doing the controllership job. And like that is, of course, important. But the real function of finance is to hold people in the company accountable for spending the company's money. That's why it was designed. The reason it's accounting and accountability like are very similar words because they were designed for the same purpose, which is to figure out who's doing a good job in the company by asking like who spent the company's money well and therefore who should be promoted. In the early days of a startup, the founder does that themselves. They have a very clear understanding of what is important to the company and who's doing a good job, and they make those decisions themselves. But when the company gets to a certain size, you have to start to delegate that responsibility to other people. And then you want to make sure that like you eventually get to the point where like, well, I have a VP over here whose job is to make sure that their people are doing a good job. But like this VP seems like they're squandering the company's money. And this VP seems like they're doing, spending the company's money well. I need some kind of common standard to evaluate the VPs. So it's not like I need to evaluate the evaluators. And pretty soon you're making spreadsheets. I mean, you could do this intuitively and by hand, like up to a certain size company. At a certain point, you're like, damn it, I need a spreadsheet. And the first time you make a spreadsheet to do that, you're minutes away from having a full-time finance person who's going to come make these spreadsheets and do them well and like make it a routine practice. And the only problem with that is that the standard accounting system that most CFOs have been trained in is like the old-fashioned cost accounting ROI-based system that works really well for existing businesses and works really badly for new lines of business. So in a startup situation, asking about the ROI is stupid because by definition, if you're in a hockey stick shaped growth curve, during the flat part of the hockey stick, your ROI is negative by definition. That's like, it's part of the hockey stick shape. Like there's no other way for it. If your ROI is positive in the hockey stick shape, you're really doing it wrong or you're lying, which is much more common. So part of building this kind of startup operating system is training the people in finance to do that accountability job in a new way using a new system.
So that's a good segue into another topic that is a good discussion about, which is the innovation accounting piece.
Yeah.
What kind of is the alternative that you're advocating?
Yeah.
Just lay that out like a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to. I mean, look, a lot of people who are tuning in now are going to be like, oh, I'm getting so bored. I'm going to fall asleep. Like as soon as we start talking accounting and math and it's like, I know, listen, bear with me. I have no interest in accounting whatsoever, except that it's necessary to build breakthrough products. And so like, because I'm interested in that, I'm willing to slog through, a lot of unpleasant topics to get there. So the core question for innovation accounting is entrepreneurs, whether they're like founders of a garage startup or VC based, or they're, an internal startup with, in a high growth company, like anyone who is in an entrepreneurial situation has one overriding bad habit. And that is entrepreneurs love to spend other people's money. You know what I'm talking about?
I do.
So, spend somebody else's money. I guarantee you at some point they're going to come back to you and ask you what happened to it. And here's the problem. Now, sometimes you raise money from someone. You raise 100K and you build your product and you put it in the marketplace and it like blows up like crazy. And it's obvious that you're just like killing it. Everything's great. But the vast majority of the time, you promised this person you raised the money from like amazing results and awesome vanity metrics. And the reality is short of that. And now, but you're like, but don't cancel my project. I've learned so much. And we're like on the brink of success. Like keep funding me, man. Don't take me down now. And what happens is most people are not able to make a very rigorous case that what they've learned is valuable. They just have a very entertaining story about how, customers said they'd like this and we just figured this thing out. We got 3 customers who say we're on the right track. And like from a finance person's point of view, who's used to looking at spreadsheets and ROI, they're just like, what is this nonsense? It sounds like you're trying to move the goalposts. You said you were going to do X. You actually did Y. You're fired. And in regular jobs, the reason this is important is you got to really look at it. Like if you're in a public company, the CEO is held accountable for quarterly targets. You got to hit the public market's expectation of quarterly targets, and that crap rolls downhill. So the CEO has to hit a certain EPS target. Therefore, every division president has to hit a certain profitability target. Therefore, every product, everyone's got their targets. And generally speaking, if you're a good manager in one of these companies, if you miss your target by like 10% or 5%, like that's bad. Okay, you actually, like, you're not a team player, you harm the company, but like you can kind of get away with that once. So you got like a track record of 8 quarters in a row nailing my target. I'm off by 10%, boss, but give me another chance, I can survive. It's like, okay, all right, you can survive that. Entrepreneurs have a habit of missing their accountability target by like 3 orders of magnitude. Right. So it's like you're not off by 10%, you're off by 10,000%. You promised billions of dollars and you made like tens of dollars, right? Like you just completely, like you're just like on the wrong. And so from a normal finance person's point of view, if you come into an office, you're like, I missed my accountability target by 3 orders of magnitude, but I learned a lot and you should like totally give me more money. It's just like, it's like, screw you, dude. If I miss my accountability target by 10%, I'm fired and you're supposed to get away with missing by 1,000%. Like no dice. So what we have to do is come up with a rigorous way to show someone in finance that what we have learned is in fact valuable. And the way we do that is we focus our energies not on the trailing indicators of ROI, margin, profitability, number of customers, but rather on the leading indicators that predict those outcomes in the future. And we try to build up a better and better and better ability to predict the good things that are going to happen in the future. So if you think about that spreadsheet that we built in the business planning phase, we said, listen, if we get customers, if we get 10% conversion rate and an ASP of $75 and this kind of customer acquisition practice, and this is where all these traction techniques come in super handy. It's like we have a theory which is like we're going to buy traffic at this CAC and our lifetime value is going to be high. Like we have some theory about what's supposed to happen. If you look at the inputs to those equations, you can build a model that is valid at 10 customers, 1,000 customers, 10,000 customers, 10 million customers. It's the same metric, same everything. You're saying, look, the first 10 customers we put through this process, here's what the metrics look like. If we naively assume that those metrics would hold at the next order of magnitude scale, like here's what the business is worth. And there's a lot of math involved, but you can actually translate those learnings into a net present value look at the future value of your business. And the reason that's so important is now you've established goalposts that make sense to finance. So imagine that I show you a business plan with a spreadsheet that says, we're going to make $100 million in the future. And then you do an MVP. You spend a month, you build an initial product, you show it to customers, and 0% of them buy it. So you're like, okay, the plan was $100 million. Current metric status is $0. That's bad. But now we have a very clearly defined, field of play, right? One end zone at $0, one end zone at 100 million. And now every experiment we do subsequently, we can show how close to the $100 million end zone we've gotten. So we start to get finance, instead of looking at how close are we to the end zone, we can say how much progress have we made from the other end zone, right? How much progress from our own goal line have we made? And when you start to think that way, you start to realize that now imagine I fast forward a few iterations and now I've gotten my conversion rate up a little bit and I've gotten my ASP up a little bit. And so now I've made like $1,000. Now, again, from an ROI point of view, I've been working on this thing for months and I've only made $1,000. It's looking pretty bad. But if I say, look, let's assume that the metrics that we're seeing on a per customer basis now extrapolate up through this spreadsheet, we're still not on track. And what's the net present value of that? It's still not $100 million. Maybe it's $1 million. So we're still 100x away from the goal, but we're way far from zero. Now we're starting to talk.
This is kind of also what you laid out. Am I reading this right in your kind of older but iconic customer validation post where you're like, IMVU was only making $10,000, but it was the right $10,000 and you could extrapolate that.
Exactly right. Yeah, because we were making $1 per customer.
Right.
So it's like if you can extrapolate us to having 100 million customers, it's pretty easy to understand that we would make $100 million in that case. there's still a lot of things that are unknown. At that point, we had a proved value hypothesis and not a proved growth hypothesis. So, we had a lot of traction work to do. But the work that we had done was provably valuable. That's kind of the key concept.
That's kind of essentially what we've advocated in the traction book, which is, I wonder what you think about this. I restated it slightly different, which is we advocate people to identify a series of traction goals that are meaningful to the business.
Yep.
Achieving those goals would be unlocking some kind of customer acquisition channel that would get you there. It might get you past there, but at least it has.
Yep, you got it.
Hypothesis is to get you to that defined goal, so you don't waste time on stuff that won't actually get you there.
Yep.
And then in getting there, you should be, putting actually quantitative numbers on your assumptions for customer acquisition and long-term.
Yep, exactly.
But it anchors, you kind of need to set that goalpost so you even know where you're, if what you're doing is even valuable activity.
Exactly right. The whole challenge here is how do you show that you're making progress? After you've won the game, it's easy to see. If you unlock a customer acquisition channel that brings 1 million customers into your consumer internet product, and you're still at the stage where 1 million sounds like a lot to you. Like my friends at Dropbox, they'd be like, whatever. We trip over 1 million customers every day. That's nothing. But okay. But you unlock a new channel that brings in a lot of customers. You're a hero. It's great. But what if you're in the process of unlocking the channel, but you haven't unlocked it yet? It's like I always people talk about viral coefficient. People want to grow virally. And it's like, hey, if I get to a viral coefficient of 1.0 or greater, I'm going to have hyper growth. I'm like, that's awesome. But what do you do if your viral coefficient is 0.8? Not only do you not have hyper growth, you have hyper shrinkage. Like it cuts both ways. Viral growth sucks because it cuts both ways. You're either above 1.0 in hyper growth or you're under 1.0 or you're totally screwed. Or if you're a retention-based business, like if your net churn is positive, you're going to have compounding growth. It's going to be awesome. But if your net churn is negative, you're going to have compounding shrinkage. And it's bad. It's bad news. So if you're on the bad side of those equations, how do you show that you're making progress? And so, I think you've outlined exactly right. You set a goal. You indicate these are the leading indicators that show that we're making progress towards that goal. And you get people bought into each increment of progress towards that goal is valuable because it increases the probability of this really cool outcome. And the great thing about finance people is they really understand the language of net present value and discounting rates. So you could say, look, I'm not promising you this outcome. It's still uncertain. So discount based on the uncertainty. But this is a really amazing outcome. So give me credit for that. And the more data set I build for you, the more progress I make, the more certain it becomes. So I'm reducing the uncertainty and therefore my net present value is growing. And finance people can respond to that. Most entrepreneurs who are hearing this, most people I've talked to this system about are like, their eyes glaze over and they're just like, this sounds way too complicated, way too bureaucratic. Like, why do I need to worry about that? And it's like, hey, if you feel that way right now, just ignore this. Don't even worry about it.
I feel the same way kind of about our book. It's like, this was a chapter, at the end of the intro, I read this chapter and I have some different words for it, critical path and whatnot.
Yeah.
I got a lot of comments on other chapters.
Yeah, exactly.
Not many people talk about this part of the book, but.
And what I've learned is, my advice is put it on a shelf and pick it up when you need it. One day, if you are successful in your career, one day you will have this problem. It's a success problem and most people never have it because they just fail, and so you never have this problem of getting close to success. Most people don't have a viral coefficient of 0.9. Most people have a viral coefficient of 0.01. And so they have different problems. They have way bigger problems than what we're talking about right now. But for the people that have this problem, this is such a powerful system for solving it. And it's a generalized system. So this is the kind of what I think is really cool is it can be used not just for traction, but for a lot of other stuff too, if you abstract to a principles level. And what's cool about that is, especially when you're building a growing organization, you need for people to be able to speak rigorously to finance or they just get killed. And so the system, the tip of the iceberg is what we're talking about now. You see the key metrics and the goalposts and whatever, but you need to be able to answer the body of the iceberg of all these questions about, well, what about this? And how do I, finance question is always how do I know that's the right metric? Okay, you said that's the goal, but how do I know that's the right goal? How do I know this metric? There's all these questions that need to be answered. And so there needs to be this kind of rigorous system that at least some people in the organization understand, because then they can act as a shield for teams to say, hey, I can actually translate between the things that you care about and the things that they care about across this functional boundary.
Yeah, we've had, I mentioned this book too. We have two similar problems that I've noticed at DuckDuckGo that we've kind of tried to address via this framework. One is, as we've gotten successful, and yes, this is more of a success problem, but you identify that next goal, like you already have some product market fit. Now you're really going for that next cross chasm growth.
Yeah.
You need to work on stuff that actually is going to move the needle for that big goal. When you're already kind of successful, like a lot of things, almost anything you do will bring you a little more success.
Yeah. It's not going to move the needle up.
Every one of these customer acquisition channels will give you something because you're already kind of successful. You already have product market fit, but they're not necessarily going to bring you from 1 million Dropbox users to 100 million. You know?
Yeah. Well, exactly. And and the problem there, like people covet success, but success can be such a curse. If everything's generally up and to the right in your business, then everybody in the company thinks they're doing a good job. But like, what are the odds that every single person is actually doing a good job? Like probably what's happening is some people are doing an extraordinary job and other people are doing a crappy job. And just on net, the extraordinary work is drowning out the crappy work. But that's silly. Every person should know for sure that the work they're doing is extraordinary, right? Every person should be able to aspire to that and have the feedback that helps them figure that out. And so we have to look past the vanity metrics in order to do that. And the curse I see people do, like you guys sound like you've gotten past this trap, but a lot of companies haven't, which is you have just enough product market fit and just enough success that you become a zombie startup. Because like everything works a little bit. So you're like, well, you always feel like you're like big success is right around the corner, but the stuff you're doing is all small potatoes. And so you're like not quite actually having the breakout that you could because you're not really willing to pivot because you're not really willing to declare what you're doing not working because it's sort of working.
Yeah, this is kind of the end of my final questions here for you because I kept you a lot. But like, you know, we have that. We've tried to counteract that by this move the needle concept and critical path, where like you basically have to identify a milestone that is going to move the needle and ignore everything else. And where I've seen people really mess this up is, and kind of we say in the book with regards to traction in particular, is they were doing XYZ traction activities. They were doing a little PR, a little content marketing. That stuff stopped moving the needle. They realized that this other acquisition channel, maybe it's, you know, SEM or viral or something, started to move the needle. They should be focusing all on that now. They still do this other activity because they're like, we used to do that. It was somewhat successful. And this is one of the main things I see people messing up when they're a little successful is they cannot ditch what
used to work.
Yeah, but it no longer works. The numbers are there that show it doesn't work anymore. You know? Yeah.
My favorite example of that is time spent on SEO. Like for enough, certain businesses can get compounding growth out of SEO. Like you think about a Yelp or something where like the actual customer activity drives more SEO, but most businesses are not like that. Most of the businesses, SEO is basically a fixed annuity. You know, you get a certain number of customers per month for free. Just you get them every month, but it doesn't grow. It's not proportional to the size of your company's customer base. You don't get any compounding effects. It's basically just it's an annuity. It's a fixed payment. So when you're small, the fixed payment of like 1,000 customers a month is awesome. You're like, wow, I get a free 1,000. Like it's it's an incredibly high ROI investment. And it's totally awesome. When you have 100,000 customers, 1,000 customer months is like, okay, it's still 1% a month growth. That's still pretty good. When you have 100, when you have 1 million customers, it's really nothing. And when you have, just like the bigger you get, the less important it is. But because people had this positive experience with it in the past, it's very hard not to be like, well, SEM and SEO are like both two elite. I meet a lot of marketing people that like I work on SEM and SEO, and it's like SEM is the potential in some businesses to be a hyper growth compounding like optimized thing, and SEO doesn't. So like if you're spending 50-50 of your time between those two things, like you're basically just shooting yourself in the foot. So like you're wasting half your time. Stop doing that. Do this thing. Like, well, I'm not going to give up my 1,000 customers a month. It's free money.
Yeah, another good example is like little speaking engagements for companies.
Totally.
Tweets from celebrities and stuff when they're already big. It's like people waste a lot of time on this stuff.
Incredible amount of time.
So, okay. So to close out, is there any other, like, when I say traction and you think people messing this thing up, like, is there anything else that comes to mind? We've mentioned a bunch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your audience has the advantage that, that they know your work and they've read the book. So they're not going to make like the truly elementary mistakes, which are like things like not even really focusing on it or not having a team indicated, like not treating it as a proper goal. Like there's certain people have this belief that like, if you're doing marketing, you're doing something wrong. It's a kind of like, it's
Yeah,
dirty.
I hope we've killed that.
Yeah, like true organic growth wouldn't have these like pesticides in it. You know, it wouldn't be artisanal or whatever. Like that's crazy. And it's hilarious to me that people describe like WhatsApp as having no marketing, which like I'm like that. I mean, it is technically true, but like there's like a very particular kind of marketing that they didn't do, but like they got traction through a very smart process elsewhere. So I think that, you know, that really is the major misconception. But I think what's more an advanced kind of thing you can get. The only thing I would say is for people who start to master the tactics of, you know, growth hacking or you know, kind of these kind of like customer acquisition techniques, there's a set of people that go technique optimization crazy. And they're just like, oh, I got it. Having these techniques allows me to turn my company or my product acquisition strategy into a spreadsheet. And I just turn the crank and out comes free money. So it takes all the human judgment and the kind of messy interpersonal stuff out of business and makes it purely rational, you know, clean. And if you do that, and you're just like, well, whatever experiment moves the needle, whatever A/B test produces better results, we're just going to switch to that. It's amazing how fast you're selling porn or psychic hotlines. Like I'm actually personally shocked when I've seen it. It's like, you know, you don't care anymore. It's like you're doing whatever it takes, and you can easily go off mission, off vision, off brand very fast. And when that happens, people are like, they feel betrayed. They're like, wait a minute, I thought I was doing a good thing. So I was just focusing on making the numbers go up, and now people are mad at me because I've gotten us into this crappy illegal business. It's not my fault. I was just doing what I was told. And it's just like, to me, it comes back to the core idea that these techniques, they serve the larger vision and larger strategy of the company. And so you got to really be clear, what kinds of experiments are we trying to run? What are we really trying to learn? What we're trying to learn is how to make the company strategy succeed, how to make this vision a reality. So doing off-brand, off-vision experiments is a bad idea. Even if they quote unquote work to get you more traction, you know, that doesn't actually help you learn what you need to know to build a sustainable business.
Yeah, that is should have included that in the book.
You can't include everything. That is the curse of being a business author. You can't include everything. That's awful.
If we did now, that's a really good point. And that is a good place to end. So
okay, awesome.
Thank you very, very much for this interview.
Really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Yeah. Stop.